We're speaking here from Berlin in Germany, as Germany and Central Europe approached the third year and fourth wave of the COVID pandemic. Over the past 6 to 9 months, there's been much talk about how the SARS-CoV-2 virus will eventually become endemic, a part of our daily lives. There's no going back to the old normal, even if that were desirable. As humans grapple with a number of intertwined challenges in the next decades, from the climate crisis to a soil crisis to an antibiotics crisis, the virus will be accompanying us every step of the way. But both SARS-CoV-2 and Homo sapiens will adjust. We will gain, both through medical technology and our own immune systems, the ability to keep infections at bay, while the virus will adapt to us as a host, perhaps becoming less lethal, as a dead host is of no use to it. We continue under the viral shadow with an online discussion exploring biopolitics in our current age of pandemic. In view of the SARS-CoV-2 virus becoming endemic, we ask, what does living with a virus mean for us as individuals and as a society? Tonight, we've asked 3 artists working on the borders of art and life sciences to talk about how viral infection, contagion, and potential cure has affected their lives and work.
Good evening as well from my side. Dear audience, let me welcome you and welcome here to our talk. Caitlin, Whitefeather, and Sebastian, we are so very happy that you take time and share your knowledge. And this is really wonderful to have you here. We also want to say that from Art of Berlin, we want to thank very much the funding sources who carried us through this really challenging year with this project under the viral shadow. So we really want to thank Berlin Senate, the Department for Culture, and also in particular the Hauptstadt Kulturfonds to fund the whole series. And we have had so far a group exhibition under the viral shadow. We have had an international interdisciplinary conference on the 9th of October. And so we're very happy to provide tonight this talks, Living with the Virus. And in a week, we have viral geographies. Let me talk quickly about our suggested structure of the evening. So we would propose that we have our 3 dear speakers presenting their talks one after the other, and I give a little biographical background to each of them. And then afterwards, we would open up the discussion to everyone. And as you are joining us, dear audience, over the YouTube live stream, you probably saw on the right side, you can always put comments or questions and we will collect them and later on feed them into our discussions and comment back and answer. So I'd like to start with Caitlin Berrigan. Hello, good evening, Caitlin. Thank you for being here, and let me introduce you to the audience. Artist and researcher Caitlin Berrigan works across video, sculpture, performance, and text to engage with the intimate and embodied dimensions of power, politics, and capitalism. Her current project, Imaginary Explosions, is, and I quote Caitlin, a cosmology in which Caitlin Berrigan draws upon geology to investigate how deep time and interspecies communication might assist us in radical planetary transformation, end of quote. And this project, Imaginary Explosions, was the subject of a solo show at Art in General in New York in 2019. There was also a solo show in the Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart. And this project is also connected to an artist book with Broken Dimanche Press in Berlin 3 years ago. Caitlin's work has been shown at the Whitney Museum, Poetry Project, Henry Art Gallery, Harvard Carpenter Center, Anthology Film Archives, and Union Docs, among many others. Caitlin has received grants and residencies from the Humboldt Foundation, the Shawhigan Graham Foundation, and the Akademie Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart, to name only a few. She holds a master's in visual art from MIT and a BA from Hampshire College. Caitlin is an artist, writer, and researcher affiliated with a PhD in practice at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and NYU Technology, Culture, and Society. And as you probably, dear audience, could read in the announcement of tonight's event, we shared already a part of a very interesting publication that Caitlin published in September last year. The essay is called Atmospheres of the Undead, Living with Viruses, Loneliness, and Neoliberalism. And let me just, before I quote this for the end of my little biographical introduction, say also that for the context, it's interesting to know that Caitlin caught hepatitis C from a blood transfusion as an infant, and growing up with the virus and seeking medical attention and a possible cure as an adult has intimately informed her art and writing. So let me now actually, at the end of my little introduction, quote from this really, really amazing essay by Caitlin. Living together with a virus is a lonely way of being. As my peers individuated from dependent adolescence into adulthood, my coming of age was not a singular human object. It was already multiple. A human carrying an alien viral load. My subjectivity was shaped by an awareness of having been seeded and colonized by an undead thing, an endless genetic proliferation with no known purpose other than to repeat itself in me and possibly to use me as a vector of infection. End of quote. So thank you very much, Caitlin, for sharing with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Regina, for such a nice introduction. And my institutional life, in addition to my viral life, I will also be repeating that quote about repetition. And why not? We are here tonight about different kinds of replication. So I'm going to put a little timer on myself, and just to say also that it's really nice to be here with you, Whitefeather, and Sebastian as well. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you both. And hello to the audience. My name is Caitlin Berrigan. I appear on the screen tonight wearing a black top, gold chain, and fluorescent yellow sleeves. My hair is cut short, my skin is what is called white, my image is prismatically doubled. From 1981 to 2015, I lived chronically infected with a virus, which tells you something about my age that my Peter Pan Dyke face would not tell you. A friend once joked that he wished he could be infected with the hepatitis C virus because clearly its threat on my life was not something that was doing something that protected me from aging. And I thought maybe it had something to do with the fact that I spent so much time sleeping, my face in suspended animation rather than lively expression. And I liked this joke, especially because I was not expected to live long enough to age. And I was also full of rage. As artist and AIDS activist David Wojnarowicz said, I'm carrying this rage like a blood-filled egg. From 2006 to 2010, my early works addressed viruses, spatial choreographies of contagion, medicine, and care. Among them, Life Cycle of a Common Weed, Viral Confections, Traces, Transfers. I have some images from these works if you'd like to see them later, or if there's enough time, but I might talk too long. And these artworks were eggs to contain my rage. They were leaky containers, obviously. They leaked and they haunted. They made messes and embarrassments. But to everyone's surprise, including my own, I did not die. Here I am, living this long. The story is long, and our time is short. Time as in no linear fucking time. Long as in long haul. Story as in the queer, the crip, and the candlestick. Look closer. You might see that this is not a waxing, romantic candlestick that kindles the glow of a cocktail party talking politely about multi-species living together harmoniously on this delicate planet. No, this is a stick of dynamite, ready to become airborne. And who will receive its blast? I have some ideas if you'll hear me out. To pop off, to become airborne. Air, as in atmospheres of the undead, living with viruses, loneliness, and neoliberalism. This is the title of an auto-theoretical essay that narrates how living with a virus reveals the structural inequalities of profit-oriented biomedicine, anticipating the long-term endemic effects of COVID-19 upon global medical priorities. The essay was published in September 2020, several months prior to the release of COVID vaccines, in anticipation of exactly what we are seeing now, the primary vaccine producers drawing delirious billions of dollars from public money, while global leaders of developed nations refuse to override patents or change policy to enable life-saving vaccine equity, driving the most impressive force of mass death from a virus ever seen, and widening the chasm of racialized global health disparities. If I can summarize for you the essay, it is this. In the context of medicine and care, there are limits to mutual aid. The state is supposed to be mutual aid. Both mutual aid and the state are romantic concepts. We need to stop being romantics and end patents and the privatization of biomedicine. To live among viruses and survive our interactions with them, think like a virus. Xenophilic, opportunistic, multiplied, and many. Our resistance to neoliberal isolation must become so expansive as to saturate the atmosphere. I will read for you some excerpts. A virus is an undead vector that traces both the beauty and abuses of our mutual reliance. The porosity of our bodies is the very interface of our social being. Where we connect and communicate lies risk for contagion. Porosity affirms that we are already multiple, interdependent, and entangled. A virus is not a metaphor. Different viruses trace divergent choreographies of vulnerability, sociality, and capital markets. Their movements within our social and material lives can draw our attention to critical nodes. One of these nodes is where notions of care and cure intersect, yet they must not be conflated. A biomedical cure for a virus depends upon, but is not the same as, the infrastructures of caretaking required to support complex needs for public health such as food, shelter, bodily autonomy, and mental health. Another critical node is where mystification and lack of open participation in decisions about pricing policies for publicly funded biomedical innovation enables the enduring power of pharmaceutical companies to prioritize profit over people's lives in the face of public health crises. ... No linear fucking time. Living together with a virus is a lonely way of being. As my peers individuated from dependent adolescence into adulthood, my coming of age was not as a singular human subject. I was already multiple, a human carrying an alien viral load. My subjectivity was shaped by an awareness of having been seeded and colonized by an undead thing, an endless genetic proliferation with no known purpose other than to repeat itself in me and possibly to use me as a vector of infection. From the time of my medical diagnosis at the age of 17, this multiplied subjectivity paradoxically rendered me ever more singular, as the contagious effects of social stigma isolated me from other human beings. First, as an abject body to be feared. Second, as a suspected user of intravenous drugs. And third, as an outlier, both an anomaly within the typical demographics of the diseased and a chronically ill outlier among my carefree friends. As we followed the North American middle-class rites of passage from high school into college, I was excluded from my peers' deliverance of their bodies to each other during substance-altered states of sex and social bonding. The ecstatic self-destruction of these rituals would, I was warned, most certainly destroy my already overburdened liver within a few short years and necessitate a liver transplant. Given the unquenchable demand for livers, the logic of medical rationing was such that I would be placed at the bottom of the national organ wait list, since I would reinfect it with the virus anyway and damage a good liver upon receipt. Instead, I delivered my young body to the vast medical apparatuses of international health insurances, clinical trials, alternative therapies, and theories of harm reduction and self-care. I had no one with whom to share my experience of this particular virus with a bland and confusing name. It emerged slowly upon the scene of public health in the 1970s, categorized as a liver disease called non-A, non-B viral hepatitis. HCV affects disparate demographics of already socially marginalized people with intravenous drug dependency, the poor, people in need of mental health care, first responders, war veterans, and prisoners. Without the existing bonds of community, no cohesive biosociality emerged, a term conceived by Paul Rabinow to describe a biomedically driven bond within stronger axes of shared identification that propels effective advocacy. It was hard for me to understand feeling isolated despite millions of people out there like me. Over time, I became aware that my loneliness was symptomatic of the permeations of neoliberal ideology within the broad and contested concepts of health and care. One ethical ideological notion of public health is as a common good that benefits everyone. When people are able to access the care they desire, they have greater capacity to actively participate in their lives and connect with others. The ability of the body to labor is of critical concern to politics. Taking measures to treat people with destructive contagious diseases prevents them from spreading. The multiplicity of interdependent bodies within this notion of public health contradicts how neoliberal ideology has shaped it into a transactional relationship between an individual consumer and a commodified health system that, for those in a position of access, extracts profit in exchange for life. As Angela Davis says, quote, "Neoliberal logic assumes that the fundamental unit of society is the abstract individual," unquote, while simultaneously enacting, en masse, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore has called, quote, "organized abandonment," unquote, of vulnerable communities from social structures. In other words, neoliberal biopolitics amplify and multiply the loneliness of wellness. Gradients of vulnerability to the effects of disease fade into the horizon of neoliberal subjectivation as they become individual responsibilities rather than mutual concerns of the common good. A sharpened awareness of leaking accompanied the formation of my sense of self. The hepatitis C virus courses through the blood, but is not found in other bodily fluids. I followed the material movements of blood with fascination. Each time my skin opened and released a vital stain of iron, protein, and virus, I covered the wound with hypervigilance and let no bloody flake of a booger escape biosafe disposal. I developed a sensory attention to where I deposited and picked up residues at all times, as one develops a subconscious awareness for the felt presence of the pet under the couch gone quiet, for where the baby has wandered. I adapted to view the world as a sea of particulate interactions. Cultivating attentive responsibility towards overwhelming biotic details has returned with coronavirus, and it has proliferated. We are not just leaky vessels that drop fluids onto surfaces. We have become atmospheres. The clouds of others press upon us in awkward choreographies. I strap on a mask in an effort to contain my breath, but the gentle gas escapes through the relaxed edge of fabric on my humidified cheeks. Multiple again, I am a particulate cloud, an assemblage, an unknown quantity as I move through the streets. And I will stop there and leave the other topics or works, I guess, for the discussion. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. That was really impressive, and that brought us already in the middle of our discussion. And as I said, if this is okay, I would actually right now already move on to our next speaker. But please, everyone, take notes and don't lose the thoughts and questions that we have probably gained. So I would like to continue presenting our next speaker, and I'm very, very happy to welcome Whitefeather Hunter. Hello, good evening, Whitefeather. Actually, coming from Hawaii, I have to say good morning, Whitefeather. And let me introduce you to our audience. So Whitefeather Hunter is a multiple award-winning Canadian artist and scholar. Her biotechnological art practice intersects post-colonial ecofeminism, witchcraft, microbiology, and cellular biology with performance, new media, and craft. She's currently a PhD candidate in biological art at Symbiotica, the University of Western Australia. Before commencing her PhD, Whitefeather was a founding member and principal investigator of the Speculative Life Biolab at Milieu Institute for Arts, Culture and Technology at Concordia University. Her current research was featured by Sigma Merck for International Day of Women and Girls in Science this year. She presents her work internationally at festivals, conferences, and screenings, and in artist-run spaces, public galleries, institutions for higher learning. Whitefeather's most recent presentations include Ars Electronica, Transmediale, the KIC Festival, or New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies, or the University of the Arts Helsinki, or Iceland Academy of the Arts, to only name the most important. Whitefeather has conducted multiple collaborative research projects with scientists, designers, and artists. Most recently, Whitefeather's collaborative work was carried out together with her partner Taney Duff, and the project is called Wastelands, and it was nominated 2 years ago for Ars Electronica Staatspreis. And then, to name only a few of her very numerous international research projects and residencies, let me just name a few at this point. Ars Bioarctica at the Kilpisjärvi Biological Research Station of the University of Helsinki in northern Finland. Or let me also name the Klondike Institute for Art and Culture in Dawson City in Yukon, or the Icelandic Textile Center in Blönduós in Iceland. Then also from the recent publication, let me just name only two. Very noteworthy is actually the text Sly Media, Physarum as Medium and Cultural Mediator, that she co-wrote with Sarah Chuka and Tristan Matheson in the publication Sly Mold in Arts and Architecture 2 years ago. And there's also text like Coastal Media, which is published in Becoming Environmental Media Logistics and Ecological Change, also 2 years ago. I could continue, but I should just mute myself. And thank you, Whitefeather, for being with us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen right away and start my presentation. There we go. Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to have been asked to speak today as part of Art Laboratory Berlin's Under the Viral Shadow series of programming events, along with Sebastian and Caitlin. Sebastian and I have corresponded a wee bit over social media during our respective COVID challenges. And I'm really excited, excuse me, to also now learn about Caitlin's practice. So I'll share with you today a little bit about my PhD research that was well underway when COVID hit, and then how my work had to necessarily adapt, what the challenges were with not only becoming very ill long-term with COVID myself, but how COVID impacted my access to the resources I needed to do my work, and the ways in which I found networks of support and community to both heal and keep working on my PhD. I'm just going to introduce you to the Mooncalf project by playing a 2-minute promotional video I produced, and then I'll go back and unpack a little bit of what you're about to see. Okay, I'll go back. So Mooncalf is a series of wet lab experiments and artistic outputs that showcase the potential viability of human menstrual serum for culturing mammalian tissue in vitro. So I was working to collect my own menstrual fluid, separate it into its various components, which you see on the right, extract the serum, which is the top straw-colored substance in the tube, and then experiment with the serum as a nutrient for growing cells and tissue types. And these experiments are meant as a direct provocation to problematize the cellular agriculture or lab-grown meat industry and its production of so-called clean meat by instead working towards a proof of concept unclean meat prototype, of course, utilizing the taboo aspect of menstruation to provoke dialogue around the hidden materiality behind lab-grown meat and the fact that it still relies on the meat industry. Now, menstrual fluid has never, as far as I know, been used to culture mammalian cells in vitro, despite the scientific fact that it contains 385 unique proteins that are not found in any venous blood. However, I do want to acknowledge the amazing work of scientist Gemma Evans at the Hudson Institute of Medical Research in Victoria, Australia, who showed that menstrual fluid can facilitate tissue repair in open wounds. And additionally, the actual vitality of menstrual blood, which we are culturally programmed to imagine as merely a waste material or even a biohazard, also contains another very important biotechnological material, and that is stem cells. So this image shows a special type of multipotent stem cell, which has already been scientifically characterized as either endometrial regenerative cells or simply menstrual stem cells, MenSCs. And I isolated these ones from my own menstrual fluid. And then this is after 24 hours of growth. So unlike stem cells that are acquired from umbilical cord blood or from fetal tissue or even from biopsied adult tissue, these stem cells are non-invasive to acquire, yet this non-invasive method of stem cell acquisition is not talked about much in mainstream culture, and it's mainly underutilized in scientific research. The acquisition is unbelievably simple, using a medical grade silicone menstrual cup, as you saw in the previous slide. Now, what I should mention about my PhD is that it's a cross enrollment between the University of Western Australia School of Human Sciences and the UWA School of Design. So it's a PhD in biological art where the expected outputs of my thesis work are both artistic and scientifically rigorous. And a great deal of my research, as you have seen, is entirely dependent on a biosafety level 2 lab, having access to that lab, which of course was suspended indefinitely when I had to leave Australia and return to Canada because of COVID. I no longer had access to the labs at UWA, and acquiring lab access elsewhere became impossible because of the pandemic restrictions everywhere, especially in Montreal, where I was working at the time. Even laboratory supplies, simple things like nitrile gloves, started to become difficult to replenish as the pandemic consumed most of those resources as well. So my tissue engineering experiments came to a halt just as SARS-CoV-2 was attacking my heart, my veins, my entire cardiovascular and neurological system. And thus, I also began to personally live out the core concern of my research, which is the way that women and their bodies are treated by the biomedical and biotech research communities, with disregard as less important or as hysterical or simply anxious, and ultimately with less care than we deserve. So as we've come to see, one great example of this is the lack of research around the way that menstruation is affected by COVID and by the vaccine, which really richly points to part of the social impetus for my research, as I explained. So one of the feminist frameworks for my research, which I haven't mentioned yet, but which I will get into now, is Witches in Labs. And Witches in Labs is the shorthand hashtag I use to identify myself and the work of others who I consider to be my intellectual kin on social media mainly. And so this has led to the formation of what I decided to formalize and call the Bioart Coven. So Bioart Coven fosters a global network of techno-feminist witches, artists, and scientists who work towards bodily autonomy and self-knowledge that can be gained through community-based knowledge exchange, particularly with regards to reproductive autonomy and sexual health. And Bioart Coven was run as an online course that I taught throughout February, March, and April of 2021 through the School of Machines Making and Make-Believe there in Berlin, with another run planned for March or April of 2022. And so far there have been over 50 members in total, including some members from the well-known activist group Gynapunk, as well as femtech developers such as Ars Electronica Starts Prize winner Julia Tomasello, as well as many scientists, healthcare workers, biodesigners, tech developers, and so on. So I'm not sure the course would have been quite as successful pre-COVID. However, it served extremely well to connect and inspire like-minded witches across the globe during the various lockdowns. And so Bioart Coven's community affect is achieved through group ritual that's conducted over video conferencing. And you've seen a couple of screenshots now. The first one was part of one of our closing rituals that happened in the spring. We also do hands-on skills development and collaboration amongst the Coven members. This is also all over video conferencing. And Coven members have also taught a number of spin-off courses in person and online, and we meet monthly now on the new moon to share our events, offer skills building tutorials, and hold our rituals. So what connects the work that I showed earlier with this community of women and non-binary witches is that we all engage in some form of biological art or DIY community healthcare practice that's intersected with magic. And some of the DIY laboratory tools that I've been teaching Coven members to make at home include cutting glass petri dishes from old jars and bottles, making inoculation loops from old twist ties and bamboo skewers, as well as test tube stands from old egg cartons, etc. And some of our experiments have included making agar plates using kitchen ingredients for doing microbiology protocols, vaginal swabbing, culturing the microbiome, as well as incorporating symbolism and ritual into our microbiology experiments to feed magic spells to the microbes that we've cultured and amplified from our own bodies. So in this case, we did a group spell that involved writing our intentions onto paper, burning the paper, and then feeding the carbon or the ashes as magically charged nutrients to the bacteria in order to allow this external extension of our bodies to be involved in completing the spell through microbial metabolism. And the hands-on making is demoed and performed together during our sessions, and our rituals are co-created through discussion groups and then co-performed in real time in a non-hierarchical structuring. So ultimately, the Bioart Coven takes a number of the theoretical concepts that I use to contextualize my work for the Mooncalf project and puts those theories into practice. And to give a little more context, formal academic context, my work has been very greatly influenced by the writings of social scientist and witchcraft historiographer Silvia Federici, and her critiques of capitalist accumulation as intimately connected to the economic and medical disenfranchisement of women, as well as Nachman ben Yehuda and his concepts of deviant science. Also, of course, science philosopher Donna Haraway and her Cyborg Manifesto that first called for the feminist embrace of technology and critiqued false concepts of objectivity in science, calling instead for situated knowledge. Additionally, as I mentioned, well-known trans hack feminists such as the Gynapunk Collective and of course, Mary Magic. And so these are some of the influences that have impacted my approach to my creative work and research with the Bioart Coven. One of Bioart Coven's outcomes is the Bioart Coven Manifesto. And this is a community ethos statement that's co-authored by over 50 techno-feminist witches and arts practitioners. So to quote, our manifesto is a living or evergreen document, a dynamic changing entity and perpetual work in progress that socially ferments and morphs as needed or desired by any and all Coven members. As techno-feminist witches of the Bioart Coven, we embrace chaos, self-contamination, and caretaking as forms of co-creation, which forms our magical kinship. The Latins used to say, in medio stat virtus, or in the center resides the virtue, but life is on the extremes and we meet there at the messy edges, end quote. And there is the list of authors. So I'm really pleased to announce that the Bioart Coven Manifesto in its current iteration, as you see here, has just been published by Snakehair Press. This is an independent feminist printing press in the US in their Occult Studies Volume 2. And finally, I'm currently writing a larger text about the Bioart Coven, including the most recent iteration of the manifesto. And this will be a chapter in the upcoming Witch Studies Reader. This is a textbook edited by Jane Ward and Soma Chaudhary at University of California and will be published by Duke University Press. So with that, I will say cheers, or as they say in Quebec, santé, which means to your health. And I'm happy to answer any questions. If you want to follow what I'm doing research-wise, you can do so on Instagram at Bioart Coven. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Whitefeather, to give us this interesting insight in wow, in such an intense amount of projects and webs and interconnections. I think we have actually a lot of ideas and questions already, but as I said before, if you allow me, Whitefeather, I keep this actually for maybe our common common discussion later on. And I would actually, as we suggested, maybe go on to our third speaker, to Sebastian Cocioba. And hello, Sebastian, welcome to Art Laboratory Berlin tonight. And let me also introduce you to the audience quickly. Sebastian Kochova is a biologist and plant genetic engineer working in New York City as an independent researcher at Binomica Labs, nonprofit focused on bridging the gap between the academic world of peer-reviewed publications and the average human being curious about the natural world. As CEO and founder of New York Botanics, LLC, a plant genetic engineering startup offering contrast research services, he has worked with academic institutions, biotech corporations, and private clients to design plants and flowers at the molecular level. An artist himself, Sebastian explores the boundary between natural and artificial in his work, exploring genetic expression as artistic expression. His work translates abstract ideas of information, communication, and relationship with the natural world into tangible visualizations of the machinery of life, often through protein synthesis. Guided by the vision of Suzanne Anker, Sebastian runs an artist-focused molecular biology laboratory at the School of Visual Arts in New York. The Bio Art Lab acts as a hypermodern art studio for undergraduate and graduate work, with teams of artists winning international biotechnology competitions with playful, speculative designs that have real-world applications like soil nitrogen testing, this project Best in Track, and actually with an international genetic engineering machines competition 6 years ago, and a tomato that produces meat proteins, and in connection here to the Biodesign Challenge in 2016. So actually to name a few, and before I mute myself, Sebastian, let me just name of also a few other projects. So there's Thoughts Rewound, Messages of Climate Grief written by children were encoded into proteins, modeled and expressed as a living testament to the sorrow that lay before this generation and the hope that a better world is possible. That was in 2017. And there's a lot actually to discuss to it now, 4 years later. His latest work, Sebastian's latest work, encodes a poem by Pablo Neruda into a functional protein which has been expressed in bacteria and soon in the petals of a favorite flower. Sebastian is committed to making science accessible, documenting his work in open laboratory notebooks, and maintaining his technologies as open source resources for the bioenthusiasts. He welcomes communication and collaboration, and I think this is what actually unites us all here and all speakers here, that's to open up science and knowledge. And so much for my side. Thank you, Sebastian, for being here and for sharing your ideas with us.
And thank you so much for that introduction. I am going to share my screen real quick and begin. Okay, so let's begin at the very beginning. So here's a family portrait. This is.
Oh, I'm sorry, the screen didn't share correctly.
Excuse me, Sebastian.
Okay, let's see, one sec. How about now?
Perfect.
Great.
We can see it.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay. So we start at the beginning. Just a quick breakdown and full disclosure. So I hold no formal degree. I'm a self-taught plant biologist, hoping to be a flower designer one day. But the tools aren't quite ready yet. So I feel like I want to do oil painting, but I am stuck trying to be a chemist to make my own pigments because those pigments don't exist. In this interesting realm between artistic expression and gene expression, there's a tremendous amount of benefit, societal benefit in the form of education. And that's where my core focus is. My personal hedonic interest in flowers is the design of novel flowers, which I'll get into. And then a way to pay it forward because, for all this privilege that I have in being able to do this in the comfort of my own home. I want to pay this forward in the manner of educational resources and being an open book. If anybody wishes to do the same thing I am literally an open book. The link to my Open Lab notebook is in the bio of all my social media. I'm available on all platforms. Message me if you're interested. Okay, so we'll start at the beginning. So here's a family photo. This is everyone that has ever lived and is living right now. Now, you might say that this is just a photo of Saturn, but it's actually a shot taken, one of the last shots of our planet taken from way, way, way out by the Voyager space probes. Carl Sagan, in his infinite wisdom, asked for one last shot of Saturn after they passed by. And the argument was, we've taken so many shots of Saturn. It's nothing going to be special. We're actually perfectly lined up. It's going to be a generic photo. And he said, trust me. After a lot of deliberation, they finally took the photo. And then he asked to display it on a massive projector in the middle of the Mission Control Center, and went up to the screen, brushed off the dust off of the screen, and pointed to a single pixel seen on near the top left side of the Saturn's rings. That little pixel, actually less than a pixel, this is interpolated, is us. This is the planet Earth. Zooming into that pixel, we see this wonderful blue dot, as he described in his famous book, The Pale Blue Dot. And on it, there are land masses. There's water seen as blue due to Rayleigh scattering. We see white, those are clouds, and we see green. That's the part that interests me most, is the green things. If you take a second to take a breath, just 80% of the oxygen from that breath came from algae in the ocean. The lungs of the world are in the ocean. 20% comes from trees and land plants, and there's 450,000 different land species, and only 800 have been sequenced. A recent paper in the Public Library of Science, not so recent, about 10 years ago, speculated that 86% of eukaryotes, multicellular complex life, has yet to be discovered and show up as shadows in our genomic sequencing, a metagenomics of the natural world. So there's so much to be discovered, right? What we know is the tip of the iceberg, and this iceberg is endless forms most beautiful. Zooming in a little bit bit into this wonderful tapestry of life, we see a very abstracted and extrapolated a tree of life, starting from Luca, the last universal common ancestor, the cell that was the progenitor for all life. And we know this only through the very, very clear genetic linkage of all living things. We are all related. There's parts of octopus genes, there's bacteria, we share genes in common with all sorts of living things. And there's not one living thing on this planet that is orthogonal or decoupled from this tree of life. So there's a oneness that we share, and that oneness is this genetic information. To give you a sense of perspective, we are here, Homo sapiens, next to the house mouse and the rubber eel. So of minimal import, we are these very strange monkeys with these very interesting opposable thumbs that eventually figured out how to cook food, grew our brains, and became what we are today, right? The dominant species. But in the grand scheme of things, we are as insignificant as a speck of dust floating in a sunbeam, as Carl Sagan put. But this life also has plants, and this is what drives me to maddening passions. They sip starlight, they eat light. They're capable of forming geometric shapes, like in the Romanesco broccoli that you see before you. This is the Fibonacci spiral embodied, the mathematical function of the Fibonacci sequence embodied physically into the cells of a plant. I saw this at a grocery store as a kid and I was blown away. I'm used to broccoli, little round stuff, and like kale, boring leaves, a little bit of a kale hater, pardon me. But the actual Romanesco broccoli just absolutely blew my mind. And I was fascinated, but I did not know the depth of this fascination until much later on in life. Plants are incredible. This is the General Sherman tree in California. Over 83 meters tall. It takes about 40 people to hug it in circumference. This has seen the rise and fall of civilizations and has grown and grown and grown. Every single day, it moves tons of water up and down the trunk of its 83-meter tall tree, thousands and thousands of pounds of water, essentially for free through the nanotechnology of capillary action, right? These small tubes within the organism can wick just like the absorbent material inside of a diaper. This concept of wicking is extrapolated to massive, enormous scales that we as humans have yet to form material equivalents. We cannot pump water up and down a skyscraper for free. We have water towers for this very reason, to conserve energy, because we cannot do what these plants can do. But my love starts with flowers. So this is a rose. I don't actually like roses, but it is the canonical flower next to tulips and daisies that we learn. And in schools, in school textbooks, they're taught and they show us this type of model. So it shows pollen tubes and anthers and ovules, and it shows for the first time in a child's experience that life can be hermaphroditic, that there are male parts and female parts within the same biological context, which is important going forward in understanding of sex and gender and the interplay of identity. I mean, there's an enormous amount of metaphor, and artists have waxed on this many, many, many times. Flowers have been so thematic and canonical throughout history. In fact, you can date some old Japanese paintings based on the flower patterns that you see in the background, because the flower du jour, the patterns and the breedings, was so colloquially and culturally important that it showed up in some of the greatest artists in Japanese paintings. So flowers have been important. But flowers are also weird. There's a grand departure from that textbook generation of that lily that we see. And their morphological and color characteristics are incredible. Like to the left, we see Fritillaria melangensis, the snakehead lily. It's one of the few plants that have a checkerboard pattern that upon maturity can actually have squares, like physical squares that don't have a delineation of tissue amongst it. So there's a patterning, a Turing pattern, but a Turing pattern that's mathematically predictable within this organism. It also happens to be the second largest genome on the planet at over 100 gigabases. For context, humans are 3 billion gigabases, right? So we have orders of magnitude more information stored in this one flower, where the bulk of it is unknown junk. To the right, we have the twin the twin orchids, or the fairy Gemini orchids. And those are tails, nothing else, those are tails. Plants also get weirder. They get so weird. Those on the right are orchids. They look like ducks, right? On the top left, it kind of looks like the flag of Macedonia. The bottom left is, I don't even know what that is. They become ever more strange, in which if you were classically trained on purely the model of flowers taught in elementary school textbooks, you would stare at these in awe and fear of alien invasion. The center image is an orchid whose stamen is producing these hairs, and the petals have morphed, because petals are modified leaves, have morphed into these shapes, these incredible shapes that as a medium, as a canvas for artistic expression, this truly is an infinite sculpture to be able to modify. And I'll go into that shortly. But they're also structurally interesting. So to the right is the blue Morpho butterfly that has structural color based off of specific pitting, nanoscale pitting within the structure of the leaves. The way the actual compounds line up together, the chained compounds form these pits. Just like if you take a CD and you hold it in the light, you see a rainbow. The same type of structure has evolved as a defense and a mating characteristic. But that's not reserved for the animals. Recently, they discovered a begonia that's iridescent, right? That has the same type of structural properties. And for me, as a wannabe flower designer, this is incredibly exciting. It's yet another bit of inspiration from nature that we can utilize and add to the artistic palette, right? If I can't paint oil paintings, then I'm just going to make pigments for everybody. I'm just going to hunt and find these pigments and make it open source so that others can paint. Because maybe my time is a little bit too soon. And maybe I was born 30 or 40 years too soon, but that's okay. Scientists have discovered ways in which we can slowly characterize and tinker with all the myriad transcription factors that regulate the cellular expression and cellular, the end fates of these cells. These small short genes, if you modify, if you truncate, like the image on the left, truncating or shortening the sequence of a transcription factor physically shortens the petals. This is a type of one-to-one feedback that would be unexpected, right? It's too simple, it's too clean, and yet it exists because nature finds a way. Nature doesn't have to be complicated, it just has to work enough. And on the right side, we see other transcription factors that, if modified, produce flowers that are interesting, right? It's a start. But for me, this is fascinating. For me, the ability to see all of the potentials within a single organism and start to realize that all flowers, all flowering plants, all plants in general have untapped morphological potentials. One of my favorite loves is galls, right? So insect galls, crown galls. These things form radical structures onto leaves, structures that the genome does not represent, the host organism's genome does not represent. And I could go on and on about that, but I'll save that for another day. So this type of knowledge, I thought at first untouchable, right? I thought I was not smart enough, I could never do this myself. But I spent the last 15 years teaching myself how to do this, how to actually do genetic engineering in the comfort of my home. So my background here is my laboratory. It's the third bedroom of my mom's apartment that I retrofitted as a molecular biology lab. We do biosafety level 1 work. Me and my research partner, we've founded Binomical Labs, and we form small, thoughtful science. So tools and techniques to reduce the cost and to spread the ability to genetically alter as a means of understanding and also as artistic expression to anybody who would care to listen. So I'm going to briefly talk about one project that happened right before COVID, and then the resulting fun during COVID. So Brassica chromaflora. Brassica, the cabbage family, that's the genus, and chromaflora meaning colored flowers. And that is important to remember. I'll get to that in one second. So this project actually started with a little bit of frustration on my end. So I think the image in front is a rose, and this is the Applause Blue Rose by Suntory, right? So Suntory, the Japanese whiskey company, teamed up with Florigen to produce the world's first blue rose. Now, if you Google this, you'll see that the rose is a cool lavender at best. It's not blue. It's not something like this. This is not what's on the image. One of the key frustrations there is that they are marketing this as the first blue rose. And so I said, nature has blue things. Let me try my hand at this. And so I came up with an idea of finding chromoproteins, proteins that are blue in daylight. And it so happens to be that the maxima clam, the lips of the maxima clam, are blue, vibrantly blue. And scientists have discovered that a beta barrel protein seen in the center, similar to the green fluorescent protein that scientists use in their research, that structure is identical to this blue clam's blue protein. So I thought, okay, express one gene and give this a shot. But then afterwards I said, okay, I have blue. And so I found the gene, the maxima clam gene, online, and then I had it synthesized for 9 cents a base pair, and I expressed it in bacteria as a test, and we see on the tube on the left. And it was poorly expressing, it wasn't as blue as I thought. And so I did a lot of mutagenesis and other techniques to change the sequence randomly, because I do not have the knowledge of rational design of proteins. So I gambled the dice. I threw the dice and gambled. And I actually got a beautiful blue out of this. So this is a purified blue chromoprotein expressed in bacteria, but optimized for the language of plants, specifically petunia. And so I have this blue, and I thought, what about other colors? So I looked up red, and I synthesized the red and I expressed it. This is MRFP1 expressed in E. coli, but plant optimized and ready for plant integration. I found a beautiful yellow after tweaking an original orange. Number 14 is beautifully yellow. This image doesn't do it justice. In the light, it sparkles. It's a chromoprotein. It's also a green fluorescent protein. So there's a fluorescent component afterwards. And then lastly, I thought of black. Now, the color black in nature is rare. For many, many organisms, we utilize the chemical melanin. And as the insoluble melanin compounds aggregate, they absorb more and more light to give us the perception of black, because otherwise carbon black is very harmful to organisms, and very few organisms actually have true black pigments. And so there's a gene from Rhizobium etli that I expressed in bacteria, and after 5 days of giving it tyrosine, the main feedstock of melanin is tyrosine, it's a chain of it, it started producing a black pigment. And so coupling all these colors together, the cyan, the magenta, the yellow, and the black, the CMYK, well, that defines the subtractive color space, right? So how printers print color, all the colors we need, is utilizing these colors and overlapping them to produce the primaries in the sense of human vision. So humans have been adapted to see light shades of green, right? So we see green more than anything so that we can discern the ripe fruit. That's one of the theories on a tree. And so there is a color gamut, a space, if you will, of what human beings can see. And the perceived color does not have to be the discrete color. So I don't need a gene for every color in the rainbow. I need the 4 base colors of the subtractive color space and then to mix them. So I came up with this idea as a teaching module. You have these 4 genes, and then you teach rational promoter design, basically the localization and expression rate of genes. These short sequences can be designed in such a way as to localize the pigments into every part of a plant, right? And there are near infinite combinations and possibilities, and so much of organisms have yet to be sequenced, let alone their promoters and localization of proteins analyzed, that this could be a wonderful exploratory process, an exploratory project for students. Something that might be ungrantable research, the ability to actually explore the natural world and provide meaningful tools to others while also learning something that gives you tangible feedback. Because if you make E. coli glow green, that's poop bacteria on a plate that goes from beige to green. To a student, to a 12-year-old, to a 16-year-old, these are abstracted to the point where it's just drudgery, right? And they're missing that this is the very tip of the iceberg. And there's so much untapped there's so much discovery to be had, but they don't know because this curricula is limited to what is affordable, to what is mundane, to what is routine. So I came up with the idea of flowers for everyone, which is now my informal PhD thesis. Again, I hold no formal degree, but some through the goodness of others, many professors through social medias are actually supporting this decision, and will be on my committee to actually form an informal PhD, which will have an informal defense, which will be live streamed, and then the information will be available for everyone under 0 MTAs, so no restrictions. So to explore this in real life, I expressed the 3 main colors, and I started mixing them as you would watercolors, right? Blue and yellow make green, red and blue make purple, and so on and so forth. What's really interesting is that if you have a stepwise gradient, you actually have all the colors in between, right? So this is proof of concept that the color gamut, the color space, is more than the sum of its parts, and a proof of concept for this project, right? And I was super, super excited. This was culminating into the largest project I've ever done, and also utilizing everything I've learned in the 15 years of hitting my head against the wall, trying to figure out how to do biology without mentorship. And then COVID happened. So March 17th, I said I had to slow down what I was doing because of the COVID pandemic. There was materials shortages. There was a whole bunch of risks. I was out of gloves. I was out of sterilization supplies. And I didn't want to compromise the work I've done thus far, and also the safety of myself and others, because again, this is the 3rd bedroom of an apartment sandwiched between 20 floors of human beings living and breathing and working and scared of this pandemic. On the 18th, I officially shut down my lab. And me and my partner basically buckled down for the long haul, however long that would be. And then, of course, early January, I caught COVID. And the actual symptoms were at first intriguing. I was like, okay, that was my chance to actually do some human biology. I ordered some reverse transcriptase. I was excited to be able to isolate my own sequences of the virus to contribute in some minuscule way using my surroundings, and also as a way to give me agency, to give me some type of control, as Caitlin said, of this invasive alien force within me. And around the 5th of February, I said I was feeling much better. Right, and that's where the thunder struck. Right, just foreshadowing, foreboding, thunder in the distance. February 16th, I felt a terrible whole body pain all throughout my entire body. Every joint was sore. I could hardly move my fingers. There was it was getting worse and worse and worse, and I couldn't quite understand what it was. Afterwards, I started trying to rule things out. I talked to different doctors. They said it could be post-COVID autoimmune inflammation. A lot of people said there's no possible way as a herniated disc can come from COVID. That's still much to be debated. What was even worse is that I had to wait until I could actually be able to get an MRI, right, to see if this is actually worse than it is. And it was. So I have 2 extremely herniated discs right now. Every single moment that I sit in a chair costs me, right? And I felt a pain so exquisitely unique for me within my 31 years of lived experience that it shaped who I am, truly. Now, the process of doing tissue culture requires me to sit, to be calm, to be patient, to work with grace, to work without turbidity in the laminar flow hood. Everything has to be sterile and aseptic. And through these difficulties, despite all of this, I managed to make my first GMO since COVID, right? Not too long ago. I named her Scarlet. And of course, it got contaminated. Of course, the bacteria that contaminated this was the most drug-resistant bacteria that I've ever experienced. Every single antibiotic in my laboratory, about 20 different ones that I've tried, would either kill the plant in the process or not kill the bacteria. So I had to section off Scarlet and piecemeal her into these dishes. And this tiny little bit of hope that I had is now chopped. As you can see, the bleeding in there, it actually starts pouring out. I mean, it was this, pardon the emotions, but wow, this was huge. This hit me so hard, but I refused to give up. There are untold billions of different morphologies that we can explore. This is from the Codex Sepharinium, Luigi Serafini's giant codex written in a language no one's seen before, about a world that doesn't exist, with flowers that are so fucking incredible that I can't wait to be able to execute this. And I will continue to make flowers, and I will continue to teach people how to make flowers, in spite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Let me just see if we can get everything. Okay. Yeah, I want to thank all 3 of you for amazing talks. I guess we're going to come back to our current situation, and each of you has engaged with science as both creative and from an artistic point of view, but also getting your hands wet in different ways, whether it be as taking your own blood or in different ways and applying it in different ways, or in the case of Sebastian, working with plants and biology. And I was wondering, let's take it to the current moment, which I think, especially in the case of Whitefeather and Sebastian, might be very real, but I think it certainly connects back to what Caitlin experienced in much of her adult life. And we're in this time of the coronavirus, the term of a novel virus, which expresses that it's new, that despite all the research of the last 20 months, there's still so much that's unknown. And yet it still seems difficult for most, not all, but most scientists and medical practitioners to admit this. Perhaps this is made harder by so-called alternative and conspiracy theories or armchair experts who just, and so on. But I'm just wondering, maybe wouldn't it, admitting that we don't know that much about this, that we're still at the beginning of a process of learning to know what the SARS-CoV virus is doing as it's even changing and mutating and emerging, perhaps a much better response. For instance, to say in long COVID, and I know this from so many people, but even from some of Whitefeather's postings about being questioned by skeptical doctors in the time last summer, for instance, saying, thinking maybe this was psychosomatic or was an anxiety connected with the pandemic. This is also something that can be applied to so many other so-called mystery illnesses like ME, CFS, or fibromyalgia, some of which probably do have other viral causes or a number of possible causes that have been such a part of a theme in the last decades, especially as people have started to, both researchers and patients have started to recognize that no, these aren't psychosomatic, but they are coming from actual causes that science has not gone there, perhaps because the money isn't there, perhaps number of reasons. And I think this is also something I think Eleanor Cleghorn in her recent book Unwell Women really describes it very well while creating a sort of a short history of medical treatment of women, and quote, the depressingly frequent response to women whose illnesses don't conform to so-called objective factors wasn't "I don't know, but your suffering isn't real." But the women were suffering in all too real ways that exceeded objective medical knowledge. I was wondering, at this moment, what can we do to take advantage of, say, the challenge of the moment of the crisis, to change medical epistemologies, to on a larger level, both as people who are active in this exchange or interface between culture and sciences, but also as citizens, to create an awareness of new forms of medical care, or for instance, that medicine doesn't know the cause of something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And we'll take this particularly into the idea of long COVID, which seems to be, this is one very good theme, but also Caitlin could talk about it in the cause of her illness in the past.
Yeah, I think we are all long haulers here. When I became infected with SARS-CoV-2, it was in the first week of March of 2020. And I was denied testing because my symptoms didn't fit within that very narrow bandwidth of symptoms that were believed to be the only COVID symptoms. The result was that because I wasn't tested in time, I never had a positive COVID test. And so as a result, as my long haul symptoms slowly morphed, evolved.
I'm sorry, just 1 minute. We can't really hear you too well. Maybe you speak closer to your microphone. Or choose the other microphone, Lena said.
Okay, let me, 1 second. Let me switch headphones. Is that any better? Yes, okay. So I'm not sure what you would have heard or didn't hear in what I was saying, but essentially, because my symptoms were drastically different from what was accepted within the medical community at the very beginning of the pandemic, I was denied testing. Then I didn't have a positive test result to sort of carry with me into doctors' offices as dozens and dozens of other symptoms presented themselves, and I was fearing for my life. Every time I presented a symptom to a medical professional, they would tell me that couldn't possibly be related to COVID. My lack of urinary retention, my inability to stop the flow of urine from my bladder couldn't possibly be related to COVID. And, various other symptoms, I was told predominantly by male doctors that it was anxiety. It had to be anxiety. I was, repeatedly offered prescriptions for anxiety medication. And slowly, I felt it was important to document the progression of these symptoms. It was in advance of medical knowledge. And I watched, over the course of 18 months, all of these symptoms start to become gathered, within the wide net that COVID has become, mainly stemming from neurological damage. So, I've been left with a lot of neurological damage and autoimmune issues. So, as someone who was working in the biosciences and accustomed to, research methods, to sit in a doctor's office and have that implicit hierarchy there where, this person on the other side of the desk who had no lived experience of the disease and no medical research to even back up their diagnoses tell me that, everything that I was experiencing was imagined or blown out of proportion or irrelevant, was very frustrating to me. And so I started to participate in a number of patient-led research initiatives, and I saw these start to multiply as the pandemic went on, of course, as well. And there are medical researchers who are very interested in having the patient perspective because the patients are the ones with the knowledge in this case. So, these are new developments in the medical field, and I feel like these are really important developments. And I personally would like to see a complete breakdown of the structural hierarchies, particularly gendered structural hierarchies that prohibit important research from being done. And, I think part of the reason why we saw such a delay in understanding of the impacts of this disease is because the majority of long haulers are women.
I am struggling a little bit with how to respond to the question. It's, it's got so many different parts in there. And one of the things that it did make me think about is that, for one thing, I just, really have had a difficult time grappling with coronavirus and long haul COVID and everything, because as somebody who lived my entire life with a debilitating chronic illness and a disability, as opposed to as a result of a very invisible virus that didn't manifest itself in a kind of something that you could see. It was always, I would have to describe the physical manifestations or what was going on. It had to be through my account, and therefore also experienced my whole life from people saying that it was all in my head and not believing me what was happening, which is why it was also such an astonishing thing for me and so affirming when I was cured to no longer have any of the symptoms, which was just totally incredible. But knowing that there are now so many people who will be potentially facing, I hope that it won't be so long, but longer term effects of the virus, that there's just so much, I have a lot of grief in that. And not only for the massive death toll, which is also so astonishing, but for everybody's lives who are then turned into a kind of disablement. And it did make me think about many of the incredible voices of disability activists and who've been finally heard. It is really frustrating that it's taken so long for people to listen to the disability community, but there is a lot of wisdom there, and these are the voices we should be listening to now. And I thought about this beautiful podcast that some Dutch artists I know did called Bar Talk with Sylvie Rosenkalt, and what she was talking about around disability justice and healing justice is that it would be very helpful if, generally speaking, everyone in the world can recognize that we are all a bit disabled, or that we all meet the world in different ways, as Sarah Hendren writes in her book. That, and I like that conceptual framing of it, is how do we meet the world differently? And so rather than, thinking necessarily about returning the body to some kind of normal figure, but how do we then think about meeting the world in different ways? And with respect to the assumptions then about normativity and about access to care, and who is then creating the priorities around healthcare and how these things are treated. I echo Whitefeather's comment as well about patient-led initiatives, and that was I'll just do the screen share then now. For just showing some of the of these works. I want to do view, full screen mode. With Life Cycle of a Common Weed, which was this work from 2007, where I drew my own virally infected blood as a means to fertilize the growth of weedy dandelions, which were themselves an herbal healthcare remedy for hepatitis C. But the this was done with a full amount of irony, that this was a completely insufficient means of care, and it was about the lack of the abandonment of patients to care for themselves. And so that's also what I discuss in Atmospheres of the Undead, is that on the one hand, patient-led care, mutual aid, self-care, DIY principles are empowering, but they need to be, ultimately what drives real power and real decisions, and that, the full mighty power of biotechnological innovation should be patient-led, and at all levels, and not just in kind of taking care of yourself, taking care of others when you slip through the cracks of biomedicine. And yeah, I had more to say and more to show about normativity of what we expect of the existence of what's out there in the body and unknowns, but I'm feeling like I'm going on too long, so I will end my comment there.
Sebastian, you were saying a little bit about your own experience with COVID, and that you kind of took it at the beginning from a scientist point of view, maybe someone who works with plants, and that, for instance, bioengineering, genetic engineering was traditionally for a long time done with viral vectors, and plants especially have a particular history, even on the natural level, of having influences from viruses. So do we, where 8% of our genome is supposedly affected by viruses. But I was also, wondering, how did you also are very much towards giving open knowledge, so kind of say a DIY and open science and open science. But how does it come from the point of view of a patient? And maybe where does that lead us forward to an area where maybe there can be much more, instead of the traditional medicine, which is top down, much more of an interaction, especially when there's a disease that isn't, or a syndrome that is not understood by by the doctors yet. So,
sure. So I'm a human first, a scientist second. But when I got infected, the first thing that infected me was a newfound curiosity for mammalian things, right? Just a tiny bit. I live in the world of, in the kingdom of plants, right? I worship at the altar of petals, but and the mammalians or mammalian culture and mammalian biology tends to be biosafety level 2, which is outside of my wheelhouse. But for a brief moment, I thought I could not self-experiment, but I could self-analyze, right? And self-analysis is empowering, but it's also a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope between falling into a false positive and rolling with that against, let's say you do an analysis and for some reason you mess up the controls and it gives you a positive result, a false positive, and you roll with that. And you're so enraged that other doctors don't listen to you that you start spiraling out of the traditional medical networks. And what I think is important is that I've seen many folks attempt DIY COVID vaccines, right? Due to the shortage, due to the lack of response by our government, due to so many people dying due to this lack of response. And while admirable, it's terrifying to know that we got to a point where we might have to take responsibility for it, but also the deep distrust and cynicism with the professionals that have spent countless decades, millions of human hours worth of studying medicine and usurping that point of knowledge because you immediately don't have access to this, right? What COVID has taught me most is that we're not prepared, but also we don't trust each other at all. Like there's just rampant distrust. And I've had conversations with folks that have been working on DIY COVID vaccines. And I'm not going to lie, a lot of it turned into this glory hounding of just sticking it to the man, whoever it may be. And that's not how you solve a pandemic. You solve a pandemic with collaboration, with open discourse, with honesty, and being secretive about these tools, or being openly confident without the data backing it, right? Even if this vaccine works, other people trying to manufacture it won't have the skills you do, right? So there's a level of responsibility that's kind of thrown out the window under the guise of desperation. I think this desperation actually brought many people out of the woodwork, especially in the amateur biology communities, that want the recognition rather than want to contribute to the greater good of humanity, right? Because science at the end of the day is the collection and the body of knowledge that's utilized by humanity, and technology is the application of that science. But if you're using this as a manner of like ego tripping or putting other people at risk for your misunderstandings, your miscommunication, your misinformation, that's terrifying. Right. And so for me, as someone who wants to generate educational material of the scientific world to everyone who wants to practice, the number one thing I'd love to expound upon and link people to is ethics, right? Is like, what are the ethical considerations? How are these people acting outside of the tenets of things that have established that are mutually considered as good, right? Like these ethical things in medicine, for example, the statement, do no harm, right? This is violated many times by many practitioners. Humans are fallible creatures, and we have done a terrible injustice to many people. But the purest idea of medicine is specifically first do no harm, and then to treat others, to be able to heal. And so COVID, the pandemic, what I was hoping would do is have a renaissance of science literacy, right? And what we saw was actually a renaissance of misinformation, right? Like the ability to mass spread all of these ideas, all of these facts at a pace that can outpace the Herculean amounts of effort necessary to debunk a single fake news, a single false fact. Because you can claim that there is microchips in your vaccines, to give a logical extreme. But to debunk that beyond the obvious, right? You have to systematically show, like electron microscopy, that there's nothing there besides mRNA and little globules. There's a lot of prerequisite understanding to be able to debunk. And that's incredibly disheartening, is to know that we had a chance to grow our science literacy exponentially, to collaborate on this massive threat, but instead, because of inaction due to our leaders, we've fractured into these like sects of quote unquote pure bloods. There are like Republican candidates who are speaking of, on Twitter, one person said, if you're a pure blood, retweet it. If you don't know what it is, follow me on Telegram. And they're talking about vaccinations, whether your blood is pure of the antibody, right? And these are our leaders. So I see this massive crisis of disinformation more so than anything, that like whether somebody wants to desperately try and help themselves and or seek out second, third, fifth, billionth opinion in something, that shouldn't be discounted from all this disinformation, because there are people who definitely are being marginalized, or being pushed away and can't have access to medicine. But the overwhelming majority of people are doing this in spite of government mandates, in spite of medical professionals saying one way or another, right? So it's more of like a contrarian viewpoint out of privilege than like a justifiable, almost irrational need to survive, because that's what humans do. We have to survive. It's hardwired. So you're belittling the people who are desperate by having the privilege of choice and choosing, instead of proper medicine, instead of following the procedures, you branch off through misinformation because it follows your own internal model of the world. And pardon the soapboxing, but that's incredibly frustrating. Yeah.
I just add one point of clarification, just for the listeners, and to echo what both Sebastian and Caitlin have said. When I mentioned patient-led research, that is a form of research where patients are actually listened to, as, you know, coming from an experiential sort of body of knowledge that doesn't discount expertise of doctors and medical professionals. It provides them another learning opportunity and to build on that expertise. And the understanding is that this is a partnership. So it is a collaboration, like Sebastian was saying. I just want to make that very clear for all of the listeners.
Yeah, thank you for making that clarifying point. And I just want to add a couple of things to what Sebastian was saying, that I also think that this, the scarcity model of having to come up with alternative vaccines is also one that is made by design. And that is that there's a very easy way to have prevented a scarcity of vaccines in the first place, and that was for the global north that had the capacity of funding with taxpayer dollars all of the research for vaccines and COVID treatments, to tie in their policy agreements of that funding that it would not be allowed to be that there had to be some limits on how much profit they could make, how much they could charge for it, and that those patents would be freely, there was free licensing of the patents made from that. So it is not a problem that even needed to exist in the first place, because it could have been a problem solved through policy before any of these treatments even existed. And with respect to also the kind of issue of unknowns in the atmosphere and knowledge, and how underprepared people were for the existence of negotiating, meeting the world with full of viral life as it is, and microbial life as they exist, always have. I'll share my screen again, and this was, back to a question also of aesthetics, and one of the kind of favorite things that terms that, for me anyway, to witness become part of the common language is hygiene theater. And this was something that I would use in all of my performances of Life Cycle of a Common Weed when I would open it up to public participation. All of this was done with, with hygiene theater in mind, and with choreography, and not just theater as a performance. There were a lot of things that were actually hygienically unnecessary, but performed the theater of it for many different reasons, in order to create a space where boundaries can be followed in such a complex environment, where there are intermingling of human bodies, plant bodies, soil bodies, microbial life, and viral viral undead life, that people could then, through the choreography of that theater, be able to pay attention to, make and distinguish how they can coexist with all of these different elements, and with fear and with danger, in a way where they can then come to understand where risk and contagion lie. And so I never did anything in my performances to put anybody at risk. And in fact, the intention was to draw attention to actual routes of contagion. So Sebastian, this is also a fun question that came up all the time, was about whether plants could become infected with human viruses, and were the plants going to be infected with hepatitis C? And so then that could open up a whole question of interspecies viral communication, and when that could happen and when it couldn't, and those questions of intermingling and how bodies work. And could the hepatitis C virus become aerosolized? No, it could not. So very different from the coronavirus, as an example, is only in blood, and bringing people to the possibility of having an attention and awareness of all of these different things existing at once. That's something that we've seen very much happening in public, the aesthetics and the communication of how we encounter the world in protocols, is that people are generally relatively underprepared to make complex decisions about those kinds of boundaries in space, and rely upon normative structures of protocols that are presented to them, which creates confusion and paranoia and fear. So a lot of the works with life cycle of a common weed were about drawing attention in a way that could make people encounter these fears and levels of uncertainty. And I definitely even made the biosafety level 2 officer extremely paranoid, because he was claiming that the plants were violating those laboratory codes. But of course, if you go to the bathroom and encounter menstrual blood in in areas, they definitely violate biosafety level 2 protocols all the time. So it was bringing attention to where we're over-relying upon those kinds of protocols, and need to actually bring awareness to the microbial level and the viral level and their agencies, and when we might be at risk and when we're really not at risk. And that's also very important, when we can play, and how those communications and contacts are happening at all times. So this was like, I was just showing images of transfers, which this was a performance done at a gallery in Berlin called Program. This was a 4-hour performance where a carafe of milk was transferred mouthful by mouthful across 4 different performers, and they were mingling with an opening, people in the room at an exhibition, and just transferring slowly the milk from one carafe to another, and then back again by way of their mouths, as everybody else in the room commingled, spoke, touched, talked the walls, which were also had a fine line of sweet flavor that was barely visible. They were invited to taste. So kind of all of these different traces that might bring attention to how we live in a world of contact and contagion already, and just need to bring a different level of awareness to it.
Thank you so much. Actually, also from my part, thank you so much, Caitlin and Whitefeather and Sebastian, for your contributions, and already for this really insightful discussion. This is amazing. This is why we actually wanted to do this event with you, because, oh God, there's so many aspects. Because I think it shows that artists going into microbiology or virology for a longer research, knowing the scientific background, but then actually providing an interface opening up to a broad audience with artistic aesthetic methodologies. So wanting to say, this is exactly why we wanted to come to this discussion and actually listen to the three of you to understand that actually, let it call hybrid art or bio art or art science, is exactly the necessary field that we need to open up to discuss science and to explore new territories and to actually reveal the bias of biopolitics, the bias, as Caitlin, you said at the beginning, the biases of neoliberal politics, of the medical as such, or as you turned out, Whitefeather, and I would like to dive in later on in our discussion again into the misogynic medical history until now, and actually including the dealing with long COVID, becoming aware of the fact that most of long COVID's people are female. And then also, Sebastian, what you said, actually the fine line of actually having DIY bio, but then again listening to the science and actually embracing this all, but communicating this with care and ethics. So so just a few of many thoughts I have now, being very enthusiastic about all your thoughts. I have seen that like a red thread through all your presentations and the projects and the research that you all have been doing and are doing. I see that there is what we could call autoethnography, to deal with the virus, or actually to feel it, and then to artistically reveal it and find different methodologies of showing and sharing, and finding aesthetical or performative layers of sharing it with the audience. I find this was very fascinating, and actually this is also the case, and I think this is the world should know about your projects and about the artistic approach of dealing with phenomena, viruses, in infectious diseases. So I find it very interesting that you probably have also maybe come in the last 10, 16 months when we were reduced, when lots of exhibitions have been postponed or cancelled, when lots of residency have not happened, or when you even not can enter a country like Whitefeather, not even providing to research on your PhD in the country, in this case, Australia, Perth. So is there, it's a rhetorical question, but is there actually beyond the artistic strategies that you have already developed and showed partially with us tonight, like self-experimentation or auto-theoretical essay in Caitlin's case, is there, by the way, is there maybe in the last 16 months, have there been new layers come that you find new methodologies in your artistic research? I mean, I just think of already Whitefeather, you said it with the online workshops and gatherings, but maybe we can actually also continue at the moment to in that direction.
I was already, with my research thinking about the materiality of my body and using it in my work, but certainly the relationship to the materiality of my body has taken on a new sense of urgency and a new dimension because of the pandemic and because of all the delays and the restrictions that you mentioned. I haven't been able to get into the lab. I've had to start to build up my own blood bank, where I am able to access -80 freezers in various labs. And part of the urgency that I feel is that my own physiology is changing. I turn 50 next year and I'm, approaching perimenopause. And when the materiality that I'm working with ceases to be produced, then I can no longer do my research. So there is this temporal aspect to the materiality of my body that I've had to confront very seriously, and try to find ways that I can continue my research even after I'm no longer a producer, which could happen anytime, who knows when.
That's very interesting, and actually perimenopause, I would just join, actually, also turning 50 next year. So maybe we have to think about also, that brings me actually to a next aspect that I noted here, Whitefeather. Menstrual blood is actually also a material to work with, to de-tabooizate, how you say in English? To de-taboo, and actually as a DIY material, and also as a shared material of open research. And I found it interesting, Whitefeather, when you said also menstruations have changed during COVID, and cycles have changed. And there is actually, even additional to all the aspects that we have already tackled, another impact there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really encouraged. I presented this research in 2019 or 20, I can't remember, at the Taboo Transgression Transcendence conference that happened in Vienna. And some of the other researchers who were also presenting on my panel have been working towards building these cooperative feminist body banks as resources for artistic researchers to be able to withdraw from. So I think that this is a really novel and interesting approach. And, I would like to foster more of these networks and connections where, we can sort of share our bodily resources. Now, the flip side of that, and something that I'm really wary of with my research, is I don't want to move into this realm of instrumentalizing women's bodies when we make things like menstruation no longer taboo. Taboo is not necessarily always just a negative thing. Taboo also has a positive role to play, in certain regards, in certain cultures. It, for one, allows us to maintain control of this material and the knowledge around this material, and develop it as we see fit. And there are so many, tissue economies already where women's bodies are being instrumentalized for profit and for the benefit of others who are in more privileged positions. That we don't want to go. I guess taboo can be a tool. And I would like to kind of maintain it to an extent, I guess, to sort of prevent veering off into that profit-driven aspect.
Yeah, I would say it's interesting. Just before, even a month ago here in Berlin, there was that feeling of, okay, things are slowly going back to normal. If you were vaccinated, you could meet, and vaccinated or tested. And then people going to restaurants or nightclubs reopening on a regular basis, and that's also played a bit into the reoccurrence, because even if maybe 10% of the cases are breakthrough, but they're happening more and more. A lot of the things that I think in the US were discovered in July and August are now being discovered here in Europe and in the autumn. But it's interesting, during this whole time, we've seen social relations turned inside out, lockdowns, travel restrictions, cases of family get-togethers causing illness and death, the meeting in person being replaced by meeting online. We've the structures that we used before were perhaps trained, or certainly trained by profit, by market, by neoliberal forces, And I'm wondering if we could take advantage of this interlude, as horrible as it's been, to rethink how we come together in social structures, especially with those immediately around us, and think in ways that we could, while so much negative has come out during this time, as Sebastian talked about, and maybe at the same time, I always say there's like even in Germany, when people complain about all the opposition and the anti-vax, there's still maybe 25, 30% of the population, the vast majority actually has gone into lockdown, has gotten vaccinated. But maybe the whole point is maybe we come out of this and think about how we can spend time with a neighbor or with people we have common interests with, instead of spending it, on Facebook, or spending it, just going out and following some kind of shopping thing, or living the life we did before. Instead of going back to the normal, which is never going to really work out anyway. What are the options for using this as an opportunity to build newer structures to deal with the so many challenges and issues we have in front of us?
For me personally, the ability to mentor and educate has changed. Right. I would have friends come over and they would shadow me in my lab, and basically lab visits are no go now. Like, my parents are elderly. We haven't gotten our boosters yet. It's not a good idea. But the infrastructure of these remote conversations have become more readily available. There's now competition with other things outside of Zoom that could allow for, like, things like Jitsi, that could allow for limitless discourse for free. And that increases access. Right. In the scientific community, there are countless universities whose graduate students and even PIs cannot afford to go to the conferences anymore. I mean, they couldn't go to the conferences prior to, but now the lessening of the prices, because many of them are virtual, it actually allows a more global discourse about science. It's not just the privileged people coming, flying into Boston for this fancy thing at Harvard. It is people from the University of Nigeria, people from Kuala Lumpur, people from all over the place, researchers, actual researchers, PhD level researchers, coming together and having discourse. Because the whole point of these conferences is to not just a network, but the sharing of ideas in a very human way, a face-to-face, campfire stories, not just chalk and talk kind of lectures. So I find that it's incredibly, though very difficult to homeschool children, right? To keep their attention, to give them focus, to engage them in a square box that's not hyper stimulating like the media that they digest after school. And the stress that causes to parents, the medium going forward will change, because this is one of the main ways in which we can interact now. Like, we can meet in person, but this has opened accessibility barriers that would otherwise not exist, right? So I'm very, very thankful that the technology has advanced to the level in which we can have face-to-face conversations with 50 people and connect essentially for free at the cost of internet, which hopefully will become a human right in the next 20 years. So this was the powder keg to actually accelerate this communication avenue, for better or worse. But I think for science and for communication of scientific ideas and scientific literacy, this new paradigm actually has use.
Well, this is very interesting. Thank you for all sharing your thoughts. Actually, so we actually touched medical epistemologies and viral vectors and sociality, and even touched auto theories of viral relations, just touching some aspects that we have been thinking of touching in the discussions. Would there be, maybe towards the end of our discussions, also be an idea how we can structure in the future, or if we could kind of like not talking about the current state here in Central Europe, at least, because it's getting really worse as it have never ever been. And I think probably also open up the patterns would be actually another discussion, actually, which is also very essential. But maybe to be a little bit what we can learn from currently and living with a virus in one way or the other. And tensions and collaborations that we have touched across art science. What could we take actually into the future, or what would you like mostly to name in a dense discussion as we are having, and we actually would like to continue in the future, of course, but what could you name today that we would like to foster more, to build on, to use?
So what I would like for going forward, essentially, is the understanding that science is an ongoing process, right? That the communication of science is, that science is a part of personhood going forward, that the sharing of information, the technical understanding of our natural world is paramount to the survival of our species. So going forward, a deeper reverence, not the faith in science, because there's no room for faith, but I'm saying the open ability to accept fault, to accept that we were wrong, to understand that we can be wrong and still have validity within the scientific discourse, I think is incredibly important. The shame of being wrong is a societal thing that has no space in science, and the few who were vocal about particular things, about against hydroxychloroquine and all of those early on were bashed because people like Dieter Raoult, the French superstar researcher, claimed that hydroxychloroquine would work. And the skeptics were below him in status, and therefore their voices were muffled. So the loudening of skepticism when it comes to particular claims and the group peer review beyond 3 reviewers in academia, I think is incredibly important. The structures like bioarchive, right? This rapid sharing of information, not peer reviewed yet, but the ability to build upon this. And then the science communicators taking this cutting edge research as it comes out and delivering it in a manner that it's not gospel, it's not matter of fact, it's what we know thus far, and here's the story presented. And for us to be able to build upon critical thinking skills. I think going forward, the most important thing for the survival of our species is critical thinking, above all, because that's what led us to things that were like Whitefeather and Caitlin mentioned, that these are preventable, right? The catastrophe of what the pandemic has become now would have been preventable had we had critical thinking, right? As a group, as individuals, we can be smart. As a population, we can be very dumb. And and the cost of that is 600,000 lives, right? So if anything could be taken away from this for future generations, is that this was a point where critical thinking was most necessary, and we failed. This is a hard lesson learned, but a very positive one going forward, because we've hit a level of thoughtlessness and carelessness when it comes to the survival of us as a species that is unprecedented, right? In modern day, we have a record now of us failing, gloriously failing at containing this. And also a realization that we are on the same biosphere. That's something that may have happened in China spread here, right? That's something that mutated in New York now has 14 different mutations within that spike, just in New York in the last week. And this whole notion of being on one planet, as romantic and potentially naive as it may sound, is critical to critical thinking, because you're standing here, someone's standing here on the same sphere, and your impacts matter. We're becoming more and more powerful as time goes on. And if we're going to have that power and not squander it for the actual survival of our species in face of things like climate change, which is the biggest looming threat to humanity, without critical thinking, we won't survive. So my hope into the future is that we use this as a hard lesson learned, that critical thinking is critical.
Now, this was like a final statement. Would there be maybe also a little final statements from you, Caitlin and Whitefeather, towards the end of our discussion?
I don't know. I did write in the essay, yeah, that I feel like being Cassandra, a flailing plebeian waif at the sidelines, and I have to disagree with Sebastian that I don't think that we could have avoided this, and that's not what I meant. When I talked about things being easy, I meant that the continuation of mass death as it is happening now could have been avoided and should be avoided going forward from now. And I'd rather talk about what's happening right now because we do have the capacity and the tools and the technologies and the biomedical interventions to prevent the continuation of millions of people dying from this disease and also from all of the other effects that have worsened all other illnesses being treated and neglected and ignored. And there was also that really sobering fact recently, or just came out the other day, that 100,000 people died of drug overdose in the United States during 2020, which is the highest it's ever been, which of course is very close to what I had been previously concerned with as well, with hepatitis C as being mainly through the vector of intravenous drug use, which of course is related to the vectors of poverty, which is of course racialized poverty. So these are for me in terms of what is going forward is what is now, and we do now have the capacity to intervene and prevent things from getting worse, and the will is not there. The critical thinking is there, the tools are there, the capacity is there, and where is the will? And that is where my rage is unending.
Powerful statement.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time with wanting to come up with a summative idea or statement for going forward, and I hesitate to go into the realm of hope. But one thing that has been sort of percolating in the back of my mind ever since you were talking, Caitlin, about hygiene theater is sort of the flip side, or another aspect, or not an opposite, but another facet of this, which is purity politics. And for those of us who work in laboratories and have a different understanding of our bodies as not these impermeable, contained individual units, but as very permeable, messy, leaky, non-pure, symbiotic organisms, holobionts. Things like what you mentioned, Sebastian, with pure bloods, these people claiming to be pure bloods, and the absolute ignorance around how bodies and physicality and our interspecies relationships in the world function towards our better health often is something that I would like to see become more a part of the conversation going forward. How do we address these purity politics that are rooted in ableism, they're rooted in white supremacy, all sorts of isms that I think this encapsulates quite nicely. So this is something that I will be thinking about a lot going forward. So yeah, thanks so much to both of you, Caitlin and Sebastian, for your contributions and for getting me to this point where I want to personally go forward thinking about purity politics a bit more.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, Whitefeather, Sebastian. This was really amazing. That was so rich of so many thoughts. And as we saw, we could probably continue another 2 hours for all the topics that we have named. Even in the end, would it be sort of a final statement or an opening up statement? So in other words, also thank you to the audience. to be with us tonight, but in other words, to be continued. So we continue our dialogues as always. What we have done tonight can be also like rewatched in the future, and upon this we can even continue our discussions. What I would like to say at the end of our event tonight, thank you also to our colleague Linus Kaufold from Seeberg Embrace to support that live stream on the technological level. And also thank you to our colleagues, and especially to Tuje, who works with us at Art Laboratory Berlin. And we are very happy to come back virtually, at least next Thursday, the 25th of November, with another talk in the context of Under the Viral Shadow. It's called Viral Geographies, and it's two talks by artist Karolina Zuniewicz and Sibylle Neumeier. And it will be all evolved in and around and by the virus and our current state of being, and artistic and outside reflections, ethnographical reflections, etc. And also what we have going on in person physically is this project. This is the current exhibition we are having here in the exhibition, Paired Immunity. And it is connected to Marta de Menezes, the Portuguese artist, bio artist, and who is here in this exhibition, present together with present with two artworks, Immortality for Two and Antimachta from the last 4-5 years. And these two works are directly connected physically and philosophically and also microbiologically with her partner Luis Grasa, who is an immunologist. And these two projects are here at Art Laboratory Berlin, where we actually have the event tonight. And we have the exhibition until the 12th of December. So please visit us Thursday to Sunday, 2 to 6 p.m. or by appointment at another time. And all at the end, as humble as we should be, especially in these times, I just want to wish everyone a good health and stay safe, and meet you soon.
Thanks so much, Whitefeather, Sebastian, Regina, Christian. Thanks so much for the dialogue.
Thank you all.
Thank you.